my sister accused me of falsifying my service record. I stayed silent until the military judge opened my file, went pale, and walked out. That's when I realized someone was done. And it wasn't me. Start with a deep, controlled breath, as if bracing for a confession, then a slight pause. Did you ever have one of those moments where your whole world, everything you've worked for, was on the line, and the person trying to tear it all down was your own sister? Because that's exactly where I found myself, trapped in a room so quiet, it screamed of injustice. The air in that room was thick, suffocating, not like a typical interrogation, but worse. It was the kind of quiet that meant careers were about to die. I sat there, hands flat on the table, no notes, no lawyer, just me, my uniform, and the relentless tick-tock of a clock that somehow felt louder than my own heartbeat. Then, across the room, she stood up. Not by my side, not offering support, but opposite me. Stephanie. She was perfectly composed, adjusting her papers like she was the picture of preparation, not nerves. Navy blazer, pressed slacks, that familiar, carefully constructed expression, concerned, responsible, profoundly disappointed in me for putting her in this position. She cleared her throat, a tiny, almost imperceptible sound that still echoed in the silence. Colonel Whitman, she began, her voice steady, almost detached. I'm here to formally report Sergeant Morgan Hale for falsifying her military service record. And just like that, the bomb dropped. Not yelled, not dramatic, but delivered with the chilling precision of a compliance report. It hit me, hard. My breath hitched. I didn't move. A few heads in the room shifted, eyes flicking towards me, waiting. They wanted a reaction, a denial, a shake of the head. Something. But I gave them nothing. Stephanie continued, her gaze fixed on the panel, on the judge, everywhere but on me. She truly believed she was doing the right thing, I could see it. The discrepancies involved deployment timelines, role designations, and commendation records, she rattled off. Taken together, they suggest intentional misrepresentation. Intentional. That word cut deep. This wasn't some clerical error. This was fraud. Dishonesty. An accusation that doesn't just stall a career, it poisons everything that came before it. Colonel James Whitman, the presiding judge, didn't even flinch. He just sat there, hands folded, eyes forward. He'd seen it all. Miss Hale, he said, you're reporting this as a private citizen? Yes, sir, Stephanie replied, and as a former service member. I currently work in federal defense compliance. Of course, she'd mentioned that. It always gave her credibility. Always. Whitman just nodded, making a note. You're aware of the seriousness of this allegation? I am, she said, that's why I felt obligated to come forward. Obligated. I watched her say it with a straight face, and a cold wave washed over me. She launched into the specifics, dates, units, plans. Fluent, confident, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed until the words became facts, not accusations. According to her, my first overseas deployment overlapped with a stateside assignment. According to her, a commendation listed me as an acting lead on a task group I wasn't technically assigned to. According to her, a unit code on my record was outdated. The worst part? None of it sounded outlandish. It all lived in that murky gray area where paperwork, with enough squinting, could be twisted to look wrong. Whitman listened. The panel listened. No one interrupted. When she finished, she placed her perfectly tabbed, indexed documents on the table. A complete package. Then she sat down, and the room waited. Finally, Whitman looked at me. Sergeant Hale, do you wish to respond to the allegation at this time? This was it. The moment everyone expected me to speak. I saw it on their faces, the junior officer leaning forward, the clerk's pen hovering. Even Stephanie shifted, just a fraction, bracing for my impact. But I didn't give it to them. No, sir, I said. 2 words. Flat. Calm. Whitman studied me. You're declining to make a statement? Yes, sir. He didn't press. Just nodded and turned to the file in front of him. My official record. Thicker than anything Stephanie brought. Every order, evaluation, deployment log, archived report. Whitman opened it, and the sound of the paper felt deafening. I stayed still. Across from me, Stephanie's posture relaxed. Just barely, but I knew her. This was the part she trusted. The system would take over now. But then, Whitman stopped. Not paused. Stopped. His eyes darted to the top of a page, then back down. He leaned forward, like someone double-checking a detail they never expected to see. The silence stretched. The junior panel member glanced at Whitman, then the file, then me. The clerk's pen finally touched paper, then lifted again. Whitman turned one page back, then forward. I watched his jaw tighten. He didn't look at Stephanie. He didn't look at me. He just stared at that document like it had personally offended him. After a few seconds, he closed the file halfway, resting his hand on the cover. "Excuse me," he said. It wasn't an announcement. It wasn't a command. It was a statement. He stood up. Chairs scraped. Someone sharply inhaled behind me. Whitman picked up the file, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward the side door. He didn't explain. He didn't give instructions. He didn't ask anyone to wait. He just left. The door closed behind him with a soft, final click. For a moment, no one moved. Then, confused whispers. A chair creaking. Stephanie turned, watching the closed door, her brow furrowed. She hadn't expected that. My pulse hadn't changed. My breathing hadn't changed. This wasn't shock. This was confirmation. Because when Colonel Whitman hit that page, he hadn't seen me. He'd seen a mistake. A flaw in the system that shouldn't exist. And people like him don't walk out of a room unless something is very, very wrong. Stephanie's chair scraped against the floor as she shifted. A tiny sound, but in that stillness, it landed hard. I didn't look at her. I focused on a chipped laminate edge on the table, tracing it slowly with my thumb. No one told us to speak. No one told us to wait. The system doesn't always give instructions when it's recalculating. Stephanie cleared her throat again. "Is this normal?" she whispered, trying to sound calm. The clerk just shook her head. She didn't know. But I did. Silence in a military room isn't empty. It's active. It means something is being weighed, somewhere else, by someone who doesn't need commentary. I sat straight, shoulders squared, just like I was trained. Panic slouches. Confidence doesn't fidget. She glanced at me, just once. I kept my eyes forward. She'd expected an outburst, a protest, an explanation she could twist. Instead, she got nothing. And that bothered her more than yelling ever could. My silence had a way of doing that. Years ago, overseas, a colonel accused my team of misreporting fuel. He wanted excuses. I let him talk until he ran out of air, then handed him the original manifests. He muttered an apology he didn't mean. I learned then that silence forces the other side to keep going. And people who keep going long enough, they eventually show their hand. Stephanie shifted again, crossing her legs sharply. She tapped her folder, a habit from her compliance days. Composed, yes, but a crack was forming. I saw it in her jaw, tightening when the judge's door stayed shut. She leaned toward the clerk. "Do you know how long this usually takes?" The clerk shook her head. The colonel didn't say. Stephanie looked at me directly. "You really don't have anything to say?" Her tone was controlled, but the edge was there now. Not disappointment, but disbelief. I turned my head slowly, met her eyes. "No," I said. One word. Her expression flickered. Not anger yet, but frustration. "You're comfortable letting this play out?" she pushed. "Yes." That was all. She scoffed, shaking her head like I was deliberately making her job harder. Like this was still about efficiency. The room settled. Minutes dragged. 10, maybe more. Time stretches differently when no one's in charge of the clock. I could feel the weight of my record in that room next door. Every evaluation, every signature, every report I'd double-checked because someone else missed a detail. Stephanie had built her case on anomalies, on edges, on moments where reality didn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. What she didn't understand was that the military doesn't run on clean narratives. It runs on documentation, layered over time, signed by people who remembered what it cost when something went wrong. Then, the door to the chambers opened abruptly. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Colonel Whitman stepped back in, no longer carrying the file. His face was unreadable, but the tightness in his jaw was gone, replaced by something heavier. He didn't sit down. "Miss Hale," he said, looking at Stephanie. "I have a few questions regarding the materials you submitted." Stephanie straightened instantly. "Of course, sir." He nodded. "You stated that Sergeant Hale's deployment timeline conflicts with her stateside assignment." "Yes," Stephanie said. "The overlap suggests." "I'm not asking about conclusions," Whitman cut her off. "I'm asking about sources." Stephanie paused. "The dates are pulled from personnel records and archived unit rosters." "Which rosters?" he asked. She hesitated. "The ones available through the contractor access portal." Whitman's eyes stayed on her. "You're aware those are secondary records?" "They're commonly used for compliance verification," she said quickly. Commonly, he repeated, not exclusively. He turned to the clerk. Pull the primary deployment orders from archive. The clerk's fingers flew. Whitman looked back at Stephanie. You also flagged an issue with a commendation title. Yes, she said. It lists Sergeant Hale as acting lead, when her assignment code at the time. Assignment codes change, Whitman said. Titles don't always. Stephanie opened her mouth, then closed it. Whitman finally glanced at me. Sergeant Hale, he said. Remain seated. Yes, sir. He turned back to the panel. We're going to continue this review with original source documents. Stephanie's confidence didn't shatter. It thinned, like ice starting to crack from underneath. That's fine, she said, nodding. I'm confident the records will support my report. Whitman didn't respond. The clerk looked up. Primary orders are loading, sir. I watched Stephanie watch him. Her hands were folded now, too still. She believed my silence was weakness. She hadn't considered that silence might be a choice. And in rooms like this, choice is everything. My mind drifted from the procedure. Families don't fall apart in dramatic moments. They erode, slowly, quietly, usually with everyone telling themselves they're doing the right thing. Stephanie was always good at that. She knew how to talk to adults, which words made people nod. When teachers praised her, my parents beamed. When I brought home a good report card, they'd nod once, then ask what Stephanie had done. It wasn't cruelty, it was efficiency. Stephanie fit their version of success. She went to the right schools, asked the right questions. When she joined the military briefly, they called it experience. When she left for civilian compliance work, strategic. When I enlisted, impulsive. I hadn't planned to make a statement. I needed structure, rules that didn't shift based on who you knew. The military offered that. Show up, do the work, own the results. No explanations required. Stephanie didn't see it that way. She saw a system, and systems, to her, were meant to be navigated. At family dinners, she talked contracts and audits, federal standards, how things should look on paper. I talked less. When I did, it was about timelines, accountability, what happens when people don't double-check. My parents listened to both of us, but they believed her. She sounded like authority. I sounded like resistance. In that difference, it mattered now. Colonel, Stephanie's voice pulled me back. I want to be clear, my intention here isn't personal. Whitman didn't look up. Intentions aren't relevant. Accuracy is. Stephanie nodded, tight-lipped. Of course. I could hear my mother's voice in her tone, calm, measured, reasonable. The same voice that told me not to overreact, to just see what happens, as if outcomes were weather patterns, not choices. The clerk pulled up the primary orders. Rows of scanned documents dating back years. Old formatting, different fonts, wider margins. Whitman leaned closer. Interesting, he murmured. Stephanie leaned in too. What is it? These orders were issued under a transitional format, Whitman said, only used for a short window. Yes, she said quickly, which is exactly why. He raised a hand, stopping her. This format was retired before the dates you're claiming overlap. But not before Sergeant Hale's deployment. Stephanie blinked. That doesn't make sense. It does, Whitman said, if you're looking at secondary records. They often compress timelines. She shook her head. The contractor portal pulls from verified data. It pulls from aggregated data, Whitman corrected. Not original orders. The panel shifted. The junior member sat straighter. Stephanie glanced at me again, and this time, there was calculation in her eyes. She'd expected the room to focus on my inconsistencies. Instead, the questions were turning toward her sources. This still doesn't explain the commendation, she pressed. The title listed exceeds her assignment code. Whitman clicked through another file. Titles are recommended by commanding officers. Yes, but approved centrally. Approved after review, he said, which includes contextual authority. Stephanie frowned. Contextual authority? He looked at her. When someone is performing duties above their billet due to operational necessity. Her mouth tightened. I remember the night that commendation came through. Asleep on a cot in a warehouse, boots on. 3 people short, and the schedule didn't care. I took the lead because someone had to. No speeches, no recognition. Just work. The paperwork followed. Slowly. Correctly. Stephanie hadn't been there for any of that. She'd been reading reports, not writing them. My parents saw the same documents, she said suddenly. They agreed something was off. That landed differently. Whitman looked up. Your parents? Yes, she said. They reviewed the records. They signed affidavits. The room stilled again. Affidavits. Statements under oath. Something tightened in my chest, but I didn't move. Are they present? Whitman asked. No, she said. But they're available if needed. Whitman nodded once. We'll address that later. Later? Not now? Not in our control. Stephanie exhaled slowly. Colonel, with respect, this feels like we're losing focus. The issue isn't the formatting. It's the pattern. What pattern? He asked. She gestured toward the screen. Multiple anomalies taken together. Whitman folded his arms. Anomalies require explanation. Patterns require proof. She hesitated. Just a fraction. Sergeant Hale's career advanced quickly, she said. Faster than average. That was new. The panel murmured. Whitman didn't. Advancement isn't evidence. It can be, she insisted, if it's built on misrepresentation. He turned his chair, facing her fully now. Do you have evidence of misrepresentation beyond documentation that conflicts with secondary sources? Stephanie opened her mouth, closed it. Looked down at her papers, flipping a page that didn't contain what she needed. I watched her realize something she hadn't planned for. She'd built her case assuming the room would share her trust in surface-level data, that authority would accept her framing because it sounded reasonable. She hadn't planned on someone checking deeper. Whitman turned back to the clerk. Cross-reference these orders with archived unit logs. Yes, sir. Stephanie's fingers curled slightly on the edge of her folder. She'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Not by accusing me, but by pulling family into a system that doesn't care about family names. And for the first time since she'd stood up and said my name, she looked unsure whether she still understood the rules she thought she was enforcing. Whitman's chair creaked as he leaned back, eyes still on the screen. The clerk kept working, pulling files with the quiet urgency of someone who understood that every click mattered. I sat where I was, shoulders squared, feeling the familiar steadiness that comes from knowing exactly what you did, and what you didn't. Earning a uniform isn't about the day you put it on. It's about the days you keep it on when it would be easier to take it off. My first assignment wasn't glamorous. Logistics. Tight margins, tighter tempers. Keep people supplied, timelines honest, mistakes from becoming incidents. It meant long nights reconciling numbers that didn't want to line up. Early mornings explaining why they had to. Accuracy beats speed, I learned. Speed impresses. Accuracy keeps people out of trouble. There was a deployment early on. Personnel short. Schedule didn't adjust. Mission didn't care. Someone had to coordinate movements, track fuel, sign off on changes happening faster than approvals normally allowed. I wasn't assigned lead, just to assist. So I assisted. Until there was no one left to assist. When the acting lead was pulled, the work didn't stop. Radios kept crackling. Requests kept coming. I stepped in. There was a gap, and I was standing there. No announcement, no ceremony. Just a chair that needed filling, a checklist that needed finishing. That's how most responsibility works in the military. It doesn't arrive with applause. It shows up when someone else leaves the room. The reports from that period weren't pretty. Adjustments made under pressure. Decisions signed off with limited information. The kind of work that looks messy later, if you don't know the conditions it was done under. But it was documented. Every change, every authorization, every deviation, initialed by someone higher up. That was the part Stephanie never saw. She saw titles. I saw signatures. She saw timelines. I saw who approved them. The commendation she flagged came months later. From a commanding officer who didn't hand those out lightly. It didn't praise heroics. It cited continuity, accountability, decision-making under constraint. Not flashy. Just solid. Her role expanded temporarily. Stephanie leaned forward. Temporarily doesn't mean officially. Officially enough to be documented, Whitman replied. The junior panel member nodded slowly, eyes on the screen. This explains the title discrepancy. Stephanie shook her head. But the assignment code reflects her billet. Not her function, Whitman said. She exhaled sharply. That feels like semantics. It's doctrine, he said. There is a difference. The clerk looked up. Sir, archived unit logs confirm her presence during the deployment window. Stephanie stiffened. Those logs aren't always precise. They're more precise than contractor summaries, Whitman said evenly. I could feel the shift. Not dramatic. No one raised their voice. But the weight was moving, inch by inch. That's how systems change direction. Not with a shove. With a recalibration. Whitman turned another page. Your report also questions the speed of Sergeant Hale's advancement. Stephanie nodded. Yes, it stood out. Standing out isn't a violation, he said. No, but it can indicate performance. Which is evaluated by commanding officers, he finished. She paused. Or favoritism. Whitman looked at her. Are you alleging favoritism? Stephanie hesitated. I'm saying it should be examined. He leaned forward. Favoritism leaves traces. Missing evaluations, skipped boards, unexplained waivers. He tapped the screen. I'm not seeing those. The silence thickened again. I thought of the promotion board, the waiting, the envelopes slid across a desk with no commentary. The understanding that you don't celebrate until you're sure it's real. I'd been sure because I knew the work behind it. Stephanie folded her hands, knuckles whitening slightly. Colonel, with respect, my concern is pattern-based. Small inconsistencies accumulating. And my concern, Whitman said, is whether those inconsistencies exist in primary records. The clerk spoke without looking up. Sir, primary evaluations are consistent across reporting periods. Whitman nodded. Thank you. Stephanie glanced down at her papers again. She flipped another page, then another. Her movements were precise, but the rhythm was off. She was searching now, not presenting. Sergeant Hale, Whitman said, turning to me. Were you ever instructed to alter or omit information from your service record? No, sir. Did you ever submit documentation you knew to be false? No, sir. He held my gaze for a moment, then turned back to Stephanie. Miss Hale, do you have evidence that contradicts her statements? Stephanie opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I have reason to believe, she said carefully, that certain records were interpreted generously. Whitman didn't react. Belief isn't evidence. She pressed her lips together. Then why did you leave the room earlier? The question landed sharper than she intended. Whitman's eyes narrowed slightly. Because something in the record didn't align with your framing. She frowned. What? He didn't answer right away. He gestured to the clerk. Pull the archived authorization memo from that period. The clerk's fingers moved again. I felt it then. Not relief, not satisfaction, but the steady certainty that comes when the truth has enough room to stand on its own. Stephanie leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. The confidence she'd walked in with hadn't vanished, but it was no longer in charge of the room. She'd built her case on the idea that my service looked too clean to be real. What she hadn't accounted for was how much work it takes to keep it that way. The clerk's screen refreshed, and the authorization memo appeared with a soft chime. Whitman leaned in, reading without comment. I watched Stephanie's eyes track his movement, trying to read meaning from posture alone. That used to work for her. Not here. Promotions don't just happen in the military. They leave footprints. Boards convene. Evaluations stack. Someone asks hard questions, and someone else signs their name under the answers. When mine came through, it didn't feel like a breakthrough. It felt like the system acknowledging work it had already been using. The assignment that put me on the board wasn't glamorous. It was oversight, review, verification. The kind of role commanders like to fill with people who won't improvise with facts. It sat adjacent to a larger compliance lane: contract performance, documentation integrity, process adherence. It touched a lot of systems without owning any of them. It also made people nervous. Whitman scrolled. This memo authorizes temporary scope expansion, he said. Issued due to operational necessity. Stephanie shook her head. That memo doesn't explain the promotion. It explains the performance, he replied. Promotion follows. She exhaled sharply. Colonel, with respect, this feels circular. It's linear, he said. Work precedes advancement. She glanced at the panel, searching for support. The junior member was reading, not looking up. The clerk had stopped typing and was waiting. Stephanie turned back to me. You were selected for a role that reviews processes tied to contractor compliance. Yes, I said. And that role began shortly before this complaint, she added. Yes. Her eyes sharpened. Do you see how that looks? I see how it works, I said. Whitman raised a hand slightly. Miss Hale, are you suggesting a conflict of interest? I'm suggesting proximity, she said. Access, he nodded. Access to what? She hesitated. Records, oversight functions, areas where documentation irregularities could be concealed. The word concealed hung there. Whitman folded his hands. That's a serious implication. So is falsifying a service record, she shot back. He didn't react. You're asserting motive now. She met his gaze. I'm asserting opportunity. I watched her do it. Shift the frame from documents to intent. That was her strength. When facts didn't cooperate, she interrogated motives. It was also her tell. Whitman turned to the clerk. When was Sergeant Hale notified of her selection? 3 weeks before her reporting date, sir. And when was this complaint filed? The clerk checked. 9 days after notification. Stephanie's jaw tightened. Whitman nodded once. That timing matters. It shouldn't, she said quickly. Whistleblowing isn't convenient. No, he agreed. But it is contextual. She leaned forward. Are you implying this is retaliation? I'm implying we consider all possibilities, he said, including why this arose when it did. The room stayed quiet. Not awkward, but focused. I thought back to the briefing where I'd been told about the new role. The language had been careful, neutral. You're being considered. Your background fits. There may be sensitivities. I hadn't asked which ones. Stephanie had. She'd called me that night, not angry, but curious. She wanted details, scope, who was involved, what systems I'd touch. I'd answered in general terms, enough to be polite, not enough to give her a map. At the time, I thought she was just being her usual thorough self. Now, watching her build a case around access and proximity, I understood the recalibration she'd made in real time. Colonel, she said, regaining control of her tone. This isn't about timing. It's about integrity. Whitman nodded. Agreed. She gestured toward the screen. These inconsistencies didn't invent themselves. No, he said. They were curated. The word landed cleanly. Stephanie stiffened. Are you accusing me of fabricating evidence? I'm saying your presentation relies heavily on secondary aggregation, he replied. And selectively at that. She shook her head. That's standard compliance practice for audits. Not for disciplinary action, he said. The clerk spoke again. Sir, I'm pulling archived board notes from the promotion review. Whitman nodded without looking away from Stephanie. Please do. Stephanie sat back, crossing her arms again. The movement was defensive now, not composed. I want to be very clear, she said. I came forward because I believed the record was misleading. Whitman's voice stayed level. Belief is not the standard here. What is, she asked. Verifiability, he said. Chain of custody. Primary source confirmation. She swallowed. And if those confirm the anomalies? Then we proceed, he said. If they don't, we ask why you framed them as you did. She glanced at the door behind him. This feels like scope creep. It's due process, he replied. The clerk looked up. Board notes are loaded, sir. Whitman turned the screen slightly toward the panel. Lines of text appeared, questions asked, answers given, concerns noted and resolved. Names redacted. Decisions recorded. These notes reference the oversight role, he said. They also reference prior performance. Stephanie leaned in, reading fast. These are summaries. They're contemporaneous records, he said, signed and archived. She pointed. That section about risk tolerance, that's subjective. Everything is, he said. That's why it's reviewed. She straightened. You're treating this like an internal disagreement. I'm treating it like an allegation with consequences, he said, which requires precision. Her voice sharpened. So my background in compliance counts for nothing? It counts, he said. It doesn't override military procedure. The distinction hit harder than anything else he'd said. Stephanie had spent years operating adjacent to authority, advising it, auditing it, interpreting it. In her world, proximity was leverage. Here, it wasn't. Whitman turned to me again. Sergeant Hale, did you ever communicate with your sister about the scope of your oversight role prior to this complaint? Yes, sir. Did you provide her with documents? No, sir. Did you advise her on compliance matters? No, sir. He nodded. Thank you. Stephanie looked at me, disbelief creeping into her expression. You didn't think to warn me? Warn you about what? I asked. She hesitated, then stopped herself. Whitman caught it. About what, Miss Hale? She didn't answer. The room settled into a new alignment. Not adversarial. Evaluative. Whitman closed the memo and leaned back. At this point, he said, the issue before us isn't Sergeant Hale's advancement. It's the integrity of the materials used to challenge it. Stephanie's confidence didn't shatter. It narrowed. She'd expected the promotion to look suspicious. Instead, it had become a spotlight, one that didn't stay where she aimed it. And in a system that documents everything, spotlights have a way of revealing more than intended. The clerk rotated the monitor back toward herself and began pulling another set of files, this time from a different archive. The sound of the system turning was steady, methodical. Not rushed, not dramatic. That was the part most people misunderstand about investigations like this. They don't accelerate. They widen. Stephanie watched the screen, narrowed focus. Her earlier confidence replaced by a more deliberate posture. She wasn't panicking, she was adjusting. That had always been her strength. When one path closed, she built another. "Colonel," she said. "I want to clarify something about how this report came together." Whitman didn't look up. "Go on." "The discrepancies I flagged weren't discovered all at once," she said. "They emerged over time while reviewing compliance data. Patterns don't announce themselves. You noticed them by paying attention." "That's true," he said. "And you documented those discoveries when?" She paused. "I compiled them before submitting the complaint." "Compiled," he repeated. "From what time span?" She flipped open her folder, scanning her own notes. "Roughly 6 weeks." Whitman finally looked at her. 6 weeks of review produced a formal allegation that coincided with your sister's selection for an oversight role. "That's coincidence," she said. "It could be," he replied. The clerk interrupted. "Sir, I'm pulling cross-referenced contractor summaries alongside primary logs. There are discrepancies between the two." Whitman turned slightly. "Explain." "The summaries compress role designations," the clerk said. "They flatten distinctions between assigned and acting positions." Stephanie leaned forward. "That's exactly the problem. Those distinctions matter." "They matter in different ways," Whitman said. "Which is why we don't use summaries to allege misconduct." Stephanie's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Then why do we use them at all?" "For oversight," he replied. "Not prosecution." She exhaled sharply. "I didn't prosecute anyone. I reported concerns, which initiated a disciplinary process." He said words matter. The panel sat quietly, watching the exchange with the focus of people who understood the implications. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about how evidence enters the system. Stephanie shifted tactics. "The affidavits," she said. "My parents' statements corroborate my concerns." Whitman nodded once. "We will address those." "They reviewed the same materials I did," she continued. "They reached the same conclusion." "They reached your conclusion," he corrected. She frowned. "Are you suggesting I influenced them?" "I'm suggesting they're not independent verifiers," he said. "They're family," she straightened. "So am I." "Yes," he said, "which is why this requires care." The clerk looked up again. "Sir, contractor summaries omit authorization memos." Whitman nodded. "As expected." Stephanie stared at the screen. "Those memos aren't always included." "They're always included in primary records," he said. "Which is what we're using now." She shook her head. "Then why were they missing from the portal?" Whitman folded his arms. "Because the portal isn't designed to adjudicate." Silence followed. I could see Stephanie recalculating. She'd built her case to survive a surface-level review. She hadn't expected the floor to be pulled up. "Colonel," she said carefully. "Are you saying the system is flawed?" "I'm saying it has layers," he replied. "And you stopped at the one that supported your narrative." Her lips pressed together. "I stopped where my access allowed." "That's another concern," he said. "Scope?" She stiffened. "My access is appropriate for my role." "Your role doesn't include filing disciplinary complaints," he said. "It includes flagging issues for internal review, and that's what I did," she insisted. "You filed a formal allegation," he said. "Those are not the same." The junior panel member spoke up. "Miss Hale, did you attempt to resolve these discrepancies through internal channels before filing?" Stephanie glanced at him. "I didn't feel that would be effective." "Why not?" he asked. She hesitated. "Because of potential conflicts?" "Which conflicts?" Whitman asked. She looked down at her papers. "Because my sister was involved." "That's precisely why internal channels exist," he said. "To remove personal bias." Stephanie's voice tightened. "You're assuming bias." "I'm evaluating risk," he replied. The clerk cleared her throat. "Sir, I'm seeing edits in the contractor's summary timestamps." Whitman leaned in. "Edits?" "Yes," she said. "Version updates within the review window." Stephanie's head snapped up. That's normal. Summaries update dynamically. Do they overwrite prior versions? Whitman asked. They can, she said. Depending on settings. Whitman nodded slowly. So the data you reviewed may not reflect the original state. It reflects the current state, she said. He met her gaze. Which isn't the same thing. The room shifted again, subtle but unmistakable. Stephanie had assumed her familiarity with compliance systems gave her an advantage. What it had actually done was expose the limits of those systems when removed from context. Let me be clear, she said, a trace of frustration breaking through. I did not alter anything. Whitman's voice stayed neutral. No one has accused you of that. She paused. Then what are you implying? That interpretation matters, he said. And so does presentation. The clerk spoke softly. Sir, original logs confirm Sergeant Hale's presence and role during the flagged periods. Whitman nodded. Thank you. Stephanie leaned back, arms crossed tightly now. So you're dismissing the report? Not yet, he said. We're examining how it was constructed. She scoffed. This feels backwards. It's thorough, he replied. She laughed once, short and humorless. I brought concerns in good faith. Good faith requires restraint, he said. An escalation only when necessary. She stared at him. So what now? He looked at the panel, then back at her. Now we review the affidavits. Her expression flickered. They were signed based on the same summaries. Which means their foundation matters, he replied. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. I watched her realize that every step she'd taken to strengthen her case had added another point of scrutiny. The more official it looked, the more accountable it became. Whitman turned slightly in his chair. At this stage, he said, we're no longer evaluating whether Sergeant Hale's record appears inconsistent at a glance. Stephanie's eyes narrowed. Then what are you evaluating? The integrity of the complaint itself, he said. The words settled into the room, steady and unavoidable. Stephanie had come here to build a case against me. What she hadn't planned for was being asked how she built it. And in a system that records every step, methods matter, just as much as outcomes. Whitman didn't speak for a moment. He stared at the screen like he was trying to remember where he'd seen something before. Not the words themselves, but the shape of the problem. He leaned back, then forward again, and finally reached for the mouse. Pull the incident log, he said. The clerk blinked. Which one, sir? The supply chain disruption from that quarter, he said. The one tied to the emergency reroute. She nodded and began typing. Stephanie straightened. I don't see how an incident log is relevant to a personnel record. Whitman didn't look at her. You wouldn't. The room went quiet again. Not tense this time, but focused. The kind of quiet where people stopped shifting because they sensed a turn had already begun. I felt it too. Not relief, but recognition. The sound of a door in my head opening because someone else finally walked through it. The clerk pulled up a dated entry with multiple attachments. The title was bland, Operational Disruption Summary. But the body was dense with timestamps, initials, and corrective actions. Whitman scrolled slowly. There, he said, stopping. He leaned closer, reading. His expression didn't change much, but his eyes sharpened. I remember this, he said. The junior panel member glanced up. You do, sir? Yes, Whitman replied. Because it nearly turned into a formal inquiry. Stephanie scoffed softly. With respect, sir, that doesn't mean it means. Whitman said, cutting her off, that I had to sign off on an after-action report explaining why it didn't. He looked at the screen again. There was a cascade risk. One delay would have triggered another. Someone stabilized it. He scrolled. Here. The clerk leaned in. This section attributes coordination to Sergeant Hale. Whitman finished. Stephanie froze. That's impossible, she said. She wasn't assigned lead. She wasn't, Whitman agreed. She was assigned continuity. He turned to the panel. Which is why this stands out. The corrective actions weren't flashy. They were sequential, clean. The kind that only happened when someone is watching all the pieces at once. The junior member nodded slowly. That would explain the expanded scope. Whitman nodded. It would. Stephanie shook her head. But that still doesn't change the assignment code. Whitman looked at her. It explains why the code doesn't tell the full story. She leaned forward. So, you're saying memory overrides documentation? No, he said. I'm saying documentation corroborates memory. He clicked open another attachment. Here's the authorization memo that allowed temporary scope expansion. Stephanie stared at the screen. That memo wasn't in the summary. No, Whitman said, it wouldn't be. Why not? Because summaries don't include exceptions, he said. They include norms. The clerk scrolled down. Sir, the memo is signed by 2 officers. Whitman nodded. Both were in my chain at the time. Stephanie's voice tightened. So, you know them. I supervised them, he said. Which is why I remember the incident. I remember the call. I remember being told there was a bottleneck that didn't escalate because someone caught it early. He glanced at me, then back to the screen. I didn't remember the name until now. Stephanie sat back slowly. This feels subjective. Whitman's tone stayed even. It's contextual. She laughed once, sharp. So now context matters. It always has, he replied. You just weren't using it. The panel exchanged looks. The junior member scribbled a note. Whitman turned to the clerk. Pull the unit logbook entries from that week. Yes, sir. Stephanie's hands were flat on the table now, fingers spread. This is turning into a fishing expedition. It's an audit, Whitman said. You should be comfortable with those. The clerk pulled up scan pages, handwritten notes, digitized and timestamped. Names appeared in a tight grid of initials and task markers. Here, Whitman said, pointing, repeated entries by the same individual. The clerk read. Initials, MH. Stephanie's jaw clenched. These entries reference approvals, Whitman said, not assignments. He looked up. Do you understand the difference? Stephanie hesitated. Approvals indicate authority. They indicate responsibility, he corrected. Authority is implied. She shook her head. That's a generous interpretation. It's an accurate one, he said. The clerk spoke again. Sir, cross-referencing shows no gaps in authorization. Whitman nodded. Which means the record is internally consistent. Stephanie leaned forward. Except for the summaries. Which are derivative, he said, not definitive. She opened her mouth to argue, then stopped. Whitman folded his hands. Miss Hale, when you reviewed these summaries, did you check them against primary logs? She looked down. I didn't have access to all of them. So you relied on what you could see, he said. Yes. And presented that as sufficient, he said. She lifted her chin. I presented concerns. You presented conclusions, he replied. The room felt smaller now, not because of pressure, but because the focus had narrowed. The center of gravity had shifted from my record to her process. Whitman turned to the panel. This incident matters because it explains why the service record looks the way it does. He gestured to the screen. Temporary scope expansions don't rewrite billets. They create documentation layers. The junior member nodded. Which would appear inconsistent if viewed in isolation. Exactly, Whitman said. Stephanie exhaled slowly. So, you're saying my report misunderstood the structure? I'm saying it misunderstood the system, he replied. She looked at me again, frustration clear now. You knew this would come up. I met her gaze. I knew the work was documented. She shook her head. You let this go far. I let the process work, I said. Whitman glanced between us. Sergeant Hale did exactly what the system expects. Stephanie scoffed. By staying silent? By not interfering, he said, by not trying to manage the narrative. He leaned back. People who know their records are clean don't rush to explain. The words landed without heat, but they burned. Whitman turned to the clerk. Continue cross-referencing. She nodded. Stephanie sat still now, her earlier control replaced by something tighter. Not panic, but calculation under pressure. The incident log remained on the screen, quiet and unassuming. No dramatics, no headlines. Just proof that sometimes the most important work doesn't look impressive until someone tries to erase it. And the people who remember those moments don't forget them easily. The clerk adjusted her chair and brought up another window, the glow reflecting off the polished table. Whitman leaned in again, closer this time, his attention narrowing to details most people never notice, because they assume someone else already has. Let's line them up, he said. The clerk split the screen. On one side, the contractor's summary Stephanie had relied on. On the other, primary records pulled directly from archived logs, orders, authorizations, unit entries. Same dates. Same names. Different stories. Start with the deployment window, Whitman said. The clerk highlighted a range. Stephanie leaned forward. That's where the overlap occurs. Whitman nodded. According to the summary. He pointed to the primary record. According to this, the stateside assignment was suspended for operational reasons. Stephanie frowned. Suspended? Temporarily, he said, with written approval. The clerk scrolled. A memo appeared, time-stamped and signed. The language was dry, procedural, unmistakably official. Stephanie stared at it. Why wasn't that reflected in the summary? Because summaries don't capture exceptions, Whitman said. They capture trends. She pressed her lips together. Exceptions matter. They matter most, he replied. Which is why we don't prosecute off summaries. The junior panel member leaned in. Can you show the authorization chain? The clerk pulled up another document, then another. Names stacked vertically, each signature dated, each initial placed with intention. Whitman traced the line with his finger. This is clean. Stephanie shook her head. That doesn't explain the title discrepancy. Whitman didn't argue. He clicked. Another document appeared, an evaluation addendum. It referenced the same incident, the same time window, the same expanded responsibilities. The language was careful, specific, boring in the way only truthful paperwork is. Read this, Whitman said. Stephanie scanned the page quickly, then more slowly. It says perform duties commensurate with acting lead. Yes, he said, because that's what she did. But her billet did not change, he finished. Which is why the code didn't. The clerk added, this addendum was attached to the evaluation packet. Whitman nodded. Which feeds the commendation. Stephanie looked up. So you're saying every inconsistency has a corresponding explanation? I'm saying every inconsistency is documented, he replied. Those aren't the same thing. She sat back. This feels overly technical. He looked at her. This is technical. The room settled into a rhythm now. Document. Compare. Verify. Each step pulled another thread loose from the case she'd built. The clerk spoke again. Sir, the assignment code flagged here was introduced mid-cycle. Whitman raised an eyebrow. Mid-cycle? Yes, she said. During the same quarter as the deployment. Stephanie leaned forward. That code shouldn't appear retroactively. It didn't, the clerk said. It appears prospectively, then backfills in summaries. Whitman nodded. Which creates the illusion of overlap. Stephanie stared at the screen. That's a system flaw. It's a system feature, Whitman replied. You just misread it. She laughed once, brittle. So the system is always right? No, he said, but primary records are. The junior panel member flipped through his notes. Are there any instances where the primary records contradict each other? The clerk checked. None that I can see. Whitman nodded. Consistency across independent sources. Stephanie crossed her arms tightly. Then why do the summaries look so bad? Because they weren't designed to tell the story, Whitman said. They were designed to support oversight at scale. She shook her head. That's convenient. It's accurate, he replied. The clerk pulled up another comparison. Sir, the commendation recommendation references the authorization memo. Whitman leaned in. Show me. The language lined up perfectly. Same dates, same incident, same expanded scope. No embellishment, no inflation. Stephanie stared at it, silent now. Whitman turned to the panel. At this point, the primary records corroborate each other across multiple sources. The junior member nodded. I'm not seeing misconduct. Whitman looked at Stephanie. Are you? She hesitated. I'm seeing a record that doesn't match surface expectations. That's not a violation, he said. That's complexity. She exhaled sharply. Complexity shouldn't protect someone. It doesn't, he replied. Documentation does. The clerk cleared her throat. Sir, there's also a note here regarding temporary reporting authority. Whitman gestured. Bring it up. Another memo appeared. Short, unassuming, signed and dated. Stephanie leaned forward again. That note was appended after the fact, Whitman said. Which is standard when conditions change. She shook her head. It still looks retroactive. It is retroactive, he said, because the work occurred before the paperwork caught up. She looked at him incredulously. And that's acceptable? It's reality, he replied. We don't stop operations because forms lag. The junior panel member spoke softly. This explains the entire pattern. Whitman nodded. It does. Stephanie's voice rose. So my concerns are meaningless? They're unsupported, he said. There's a difference. She fell silent. The clerk continued pulling records, but the urgency had faded. What remained was confirmation, layer after layer of it. Whitman closed one document and opened another. "This is why I left the room earlier," he said, not looking at anyone in particular. "The formatting on one memo didn't match the summary version." "That's not random." Stephanie looked up. "So, you suspected?" "I suspected the summaries were misleading," he said, "and that someone treated them as definitive." Her jaw tightened. "I didn't alter anything." "No one has said you did," he replied. "But reliance has consequences." He turned to the clerk. "At this point, do you see any primary records supporting falsification?" She shook her head. "No, sir." Whitman nodded. "Then the allegation lacks evidentiary support." Stephanie leaned back, staring at the ceiling for a second before bringing her gaze back down. "So that's it." Whitman didn't answer right away. He gathered a few documents, stacking them neatly. "Paperwork doesn't lie," he said. "But it can be misunderstood." He looked at her, especially by people who only see part of it. The room felt different now, lighter, but not relaxed. The weight hadn't disappeared. It had moved from me to the complaint itself. And once that shift happens, the system doesn't rewind. It keeps examining, asking not just what was claimed, but how and why it was claimed in the first place. Whitman didn't announce a conclusion. He changed posture. It was subtle, the way authority often is. He straightened the stack of papers in front of him, aligned the corners, and slid one document to the side. The clerk mirrored the movement by closing a window on her screen and opening another, this one labeled with internal tracking codes instead of names. "Before we proceed," Whitman said, "we need to address the status of the complaint itself." Stephanie lifted her chin. "On what grounds?" "On evidentiary sufficiency," he replied. "And on process." The junior panel member looked up. "Sir?" Whitman turned slightly. "When an allegation relies primarily on derivative data and omits primary corroboration, it raises a procedural concern." Stephanie crossed her arms. "That sounds like semantics." "It's governance," he said. "And governance determines jurisdiction." The clerk spoke quietly. "Sir, initiating a disciplinary action requires a threshold finding." Whitman nodded. "Which we no longer have." Stephanie leaned forward. "You can't just dismiss a report because it's inconvenient." Whitman met her gaze. "I can set it aside when it's unsupported." He turned to the clerk. "Change the case status to administrative review." The clerk's fingers moved. A status indicator on the screen shifted color. Stephanie's eyes flicked to it. "What does that mean?" "It means," Whitman said, "we're no longer evaluating Sergeant Hale's record for misconduct." She stared at him. "Then what are you evaluating?" "The complaint," he said. "Its construction, sourcing, and intent." The room absorbed that. I felt it in my shoulders first, the tension easing in a way that wasn't relief so much as recalibration. The weight had moved completely now. The question wasn't whether I'd done something wrong. It was why someone had insisted that I had. Stephanie shook her head slowly. "You're turning this into an investigation of the reporter." "I'm turning it into a review," Whitman corrected. "Which is standard when allegations fail to meet threshold." "That's retaliatory," she said. "It's reciprocal," he replied. "The system doesn't punish people for reporting. It does examine how reports are made." The junior panel member glanced at the clerk. "What triggers a review like this?" "Material reliance on non-authoritative sources," the clerk said. "Selective presentation. Timing anomalies." Stephanie laughed sharp. "Timing again." Whitman didn't smile. "Yes, timing again." He leaned back. "You filed this complaint 9 days after your sister's selection for an oversight role intersecting with compliance processes." "That's coincidence," Stephanie said. "Perhaps," he replied, "but coincidence doesn't negate scrutiny." She leaned back, arms still crossed. "So what now?" "You clear her and move on." Whitman didn't answer immediately. He flipped a page, then another, reading as he spoke. "We document findings. We annotate the record. We ensure no adverse action proceeds." "And my concerns?" she pressed. "They're recorded," he said, "along with their limitations." The clerk looked up. "Sir, do you want to flag potential conflicts of interest?" Whitman nodded. "Yes." Stephanie stiffened. "Conflict?" "The familial relationship?" "And your professional proximity," he said. She opened her mouth, then stopped herself. "That's unfair." "It's relevant," he replied. "Disclosure exists for a reason." The junior panel member added, "It doesn't imply wrongdoing. It contextualizes." Stephanie's jaw tightened. "Context again." Whitman nodded. Always. He turned to me. Sergeant Hale. Your service record will be annotated to reflect this review. Yes, sir. There will be no adverse action, he continued. Your selection remains intact. Yes, sir. Stephanie looked between us. So she walks away clean. She walks away accurate, Whitman said. The clerk typed steadily, documenting in real time. The language on the screen shifted from accusatory to procedural. Terms like allegation and discrepancy were replaced with review findings and source limitations. Stephanie leaned forward. You're invalidating weeks of work. Whitman looked at her. I'm qualifying it. She scoffed. That's a polite way to say dismissing. It's a precise way to say correcting, he replied. The junior panel member glanced at Stephanie. Miss Hale, did you consult your organization's ethics office before filing? She hesitated. I didn't think it was necessary. Whitman raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because this was a military matter, she said. And you're a civilian contractor, he replied. Which is why consultation matters. She exhaled sharply. So now my clearance is at issue? Whitman's voice remained even. That depends on what the review finds. Her eyes widened slightly. You're serious? I am, he said. Accuracy cuts both ways. The clerk spoke again. Sir, do you want to initiate a referral to the compliance liaison? Whitman nodded. Yes. Limited scope. Stephanie sat back slowly. The room felt quieter, but not empty. The quiet of a system shifting into a different mode. I watched her process the realization that the momentum she'd created hadn't vanished. It had redirected. And now it wasn't aimed at me. You're saying, she said carefully, that my report may have consequences for me? I'm saying, Whitman replied, that actions in regulated systems always do. She laughed softly, a sound without humor. I was trying to protect integrity. And we're protecting it, he said, by applying the same standards to everyone. The clerk finalized an entry and looked up. Status updated, sir. Whitman nodded. Good. He gathered the documents in front of him, separating them into two stacks, one thinner, one thicker. The thinner stack slid toward me. These are the findings related to your record, he said. They'll be added as a closure note. Yes, sir. The thicker stack remained where it was. And these, he said, pertain to the complaint. Stephanie's eyes followed the papers like they were moving objects she couldn't stop. She looked at me, searching for something, a reaction, a comment, an expression she could frame. I gave her none. Whitman stood, not to leave this time, but to reposition himself at the head of the table. We'll recess briefly to allow the review to formalize. Stephanie started to speak, then stopped. The system had turned. Not with a gavel, not with a declaration. With a change in focus so clean, it felt almost impersonal. That's how reversals happen here. Not loudly. Not all at once. They happen when the question stops being who did something wrong, and becomes how is a claim built. And once that question is on the table, it doesn't need anyone's permission to keep going. The recess didn't empty the room, it thinned it. Whitman stepped out with the clerk, leaving the panel seated and the screen frozen on a neutral administrative page. No one spoke. No one checked their phone. The air felt tighter now, not because of pressure, but because there was nothing left to control. Stephanie broke first. This is unbelievable, she said, her voice low, but sharp. I tried to do this the right way. I didn't answer. She turned toward me fully, her chair scraping louder than she meant it to. You could have said something earlier. I kept my hands flat on the table. I did. When you demanded. When I didn't interfere. I said when I let the record speak. She shook her head. That's not fair. Neither is accusing someone of fraud, I replied. Her mouth tightened. You know why I did this. I looked at her then. Not with anger. With something closer to recognition. You did it because you thought you were losing control. Her eyes flashed. That's not true. You asked about my new role, I said. You wanted to know what I'd be reviewing. That's normal. It's curious, I said. And it became urgent. She stood up abruptly, paced a few steps, then stopped. You don't understand the pressure I'm under. I understand systems, I said. Pressure doesn't change how they work. She laughed, bitter. Easy for you to say. You wear a uniform. People assume you're honest. They assume I'm accountable, I corrected. There's a difference. She turned back to me. You think this ends here? I think it already did, I said. Her expression hardened. You're enjoying this. No, I said. I'm finished with it. She stared at me, searching for something she could use. Mom and Dad trusted me. I nodded. They trusted you with partial information. She scoffed. They signed affidavits based on summaries. Not originals, I said. Her voice rose slightly. You're blaming them now? I'm stating facts, I said. The same ones you relied on. She stopped pacing. They didn't want you embarrassed. They helped file a complaint that could have ended my career, I said. That's not protection. She crossed her arms. You've always been dramatic. I smiled once. And you've always been confident. The door opened and my parents stepped in. They hadn't been present for the hearing itself, but now they stood just inside the room, unsure where to look. My mother's hands were clasped tightly. My father's posture was rigid, like he was bracing for impact. Stephanie turned toward them immediately. They're twisting this. My mother looked at her, then at me. What's happening? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Stephanie stepped closer to them. The judge is overreaching. This was supposed to be about Morgan's record. My father frowned. Isn't it? Stephanie hesitated. It's become more complicated. That's one way to put it, I said. My mother turned to me. Why didn't you tell us there was more to this? I met her eyes. You didn't ask. She flinched slightly. We thought you were hiding something. You assumed, I said. Stephanie scoffed. Don't turn this on them. They signed sworn statements. That matters, I replied. My father's jaw tightened. We trusted you. Stephanie nodded. And you should have. I spoke before she could continue. You trusted her process, not the facts. My mother's voice wavered. Are you saying she was wrong? I'm saying she didn't verify, I said. Stephanie's tone sharpened. I verified what I could see. And ignored what you couldn't, I replied. The room went quiet again. My father rubbed his temples. This wasn't supposed to go this far. It was always going to, I said. You don't accuse someone of falsifying a service record and expect it to stay small. Stephanie turned on him. I did this to protect all of us. My father looked at her, really looked. From what? She opened her mouth, then stopped. My mother's eyes flicked between us. Is there something else? Stephanie's silence answered the question better than words. I stood up slowly, the chair legs whispering. This is where I step out. My mother looked startled. You're leaving? I'm done, I said. Stephanie laughed sharply. Running away again. No, I said, walking away. My father's voice was low. You don't have to do that. I do, I said, because this isn't about misunderstanding anymore. Stephanie stepped toward me. You think you're better than us now? I think I'm separate, I replied. She stared at me, anger and something else mixing in her expression. You're going to regret this. I shook my head. I already didn't. The door opened again. Whitman re-entered with the clerk, their expressions neutral, professional. Please be seated, Whitman said. I sat back down, not because I had to, but because I chose to. Stephanie returned to her chair more slowly this time. My parents remained standing at the back, uncertain and quiet. Whitman glanced around the room, taking in the shift. He didn't need it explained. We're resuming. The clerk placed updated documents on the table, sliding one set toward me and another toward Stephanie. This review is nearing closure, Whitman said. Stephanie stiffened. My mother clasped her hands tighter. Whitman continued. Before we conclude, there are matters of record we need to address. Stephanie leaned forward. About her? Whitman's gaze moved to her. About everyone involved. The words settled heavily. I felt something settle inside me, too. Not triumph. Not vindication. Distance. The kind that forms when you realize the people who raised you don't recognize the rules you live by anymore. Family drama doesn't explode. It fractures quietly, permanently. And once it does, there's no system in the world designed to put it back together. Whitman didn't raise his voice when he spoke again. He didn't need to. The record reflects, he said, eyes on the document in front of him, that the allegation of falsifying a service record is unsupported by primary documentation. The words were plain, procedural, the kind of language that doesn't invite argument. He continued, the review confirms consistency across archived orders, authorization memos, unit logs, and evaluation addenda. The clerk typed steadily as he spoke, capturing every line in the official record. There will be no adverse action taken against Sergeant Morgan Hale. Whitman said. Her service record remains intact. I nodded once. Yes, sir. Stephanie didn't move. Whitman turned a page. This review also notes material reliance on derivative data, selective interpretation, and the absence of primary verification in the submitted complaint. Stephanie's fingers tightened on the table. As such, Whitman went on, the complaint is closed as unsubstantiated. The clerk changed the status indicator again. Another color, another system confirmation. Whitman finally looked up. Miss Hale. Stephanie met his gaze. Yes? This does not constitute a finding of misconduct on your part, he said. However, the record will reflect concerns regarding process and disclosure. Her voice was thin. What kind of concerns? Conflict of interest, he replied. Scope of authority. Escalation without internal consultation. She swallowed. And my clearance? Whitman paused just long enough for the question to land. That will be handled by the appropriate office. The words were neither a threat nor a promise. They were a handoff. The clerk placed a final document in front of me and slid it across the table. Sergeant Hale, please review and sign. I scanned it quickly, closure language, review summary, no qualifiers, no footnotes that could be misread later. I signed. Whitman nodded. You're cleared to return to duty. Yes, sir. Stephanie looked at the paper in front of her, then up at him. So, that's it. That's the review, Whitman said. She laughed quietly. After everything. He met her expression without sympathy. Systems don't respond to feelings. The clerk gathered the remaining documents and stood. Sir, all entries have been logged. Whitman nodded. Thank you. The panel members rose, chairs moving in unison. No applause. No acknowledgement. Just the end of a process that had done exactly what it was designed to do. Whitman turned to me one last time. Sergeant Hale. Yes, sir. You handled this correctly. I held his gaze. I know, sir. He inclined his head slightly. That was all. The room began to empty. The panel filed out first. The clerk followed, carrying the record with her. Whitman left without ceremony, already focused on whatever came next. I gathered my things, nothing more than I'd arrived with, and stood. Stephanie remained seated. My parents stood near the back, unsure whether to approach. My mother took a tentative step forward. Morgan. I didn't turn. I don't have anything to say, I said, keeping my voice even. And I don't need anything explained. My father cleared his throat. We didn't know. You didn't check, I replied. Stephanie stood abruptly. So, you just walk out? I faced her then. Not with anger. Not with satisfaction. With clarity. I said. She shook her head. You think you've won? No, I said. I think I'm done. She scoffed. You're throwing us away. I'm leaving a situation that required me to defend my existence, I said. Those aren't the same thing. My mother's eyes filled. You're still our daughter. I nodded. And I'm still accountable to my oath. Stephanie laughed bitterly. You always choose the system. I choose reality, I said. The system just records it. I walked toward the door. No one stopped me. Outside, the hallway was quiet, not empty, just calm in the way institutional spaces are once decisions have been finalized. I took a breath I hadn't noticed I'd been holding and adjusted my uniform. My phone buzzed once. A message from my unit, short, direct, acknowledging my return. I typed a brief response and slipped the phone back into my pocket. The elevator doors opened. I stepped inside and watched the reflection of my uniform in the mirrored wall. No cracks, no stains. Just fabric, rank, and the weight of choices made and owned. When the doors closed, the building didn't feel smaller behind me. It felt complete. Outside, the air was colder than it had been that morning. Clearer. I walked toward my car without hurry. Each step unremarkable, in the way real resolutions usually are. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel wounded. I felt accurate. In the military, accuracy isn't a personality trait. It's survival. It's how you keep the wrong story from becoming the official one. My sister had tried to rewrite my record. The system had declined. Not because it favored me, not because it punished her, but because the truth had already been filed, signed, and stored in places that don't care who you are to each other. I drove away without looking back. There was work waiting. Deep breath, slightly reflective tone. You know, going through something like that with your own family, it changes you. It makes you question everything you thought you knew about trust, about loyalty, about what really matters when push comes to shove. Have any of you ever faced a moment where you had to stand firm on your truth, even when it meant breaking ties with someone close? What did you do? I'd really love to hear your stories in the comments below.